Airport security swung a handcuff chain at a judge's family seconds later. That very chain was snapped around his own neck, and what happened next will leave you speechless. The chain swung, cracking against the boy's skull, blood splattering across the cold terminal floor. Subscribe if you believe no child should ever suffer violence. The moment began as ordinary as any travel day at Brenton International. Fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, and the low hum of announcements echoed across the terminal as travelers moved like waves around kiosks, luggage belts, and security lanes. Judge Adrian Kessler stood at the edge of Checkpoint B, towering and composed, his presence dignified even in the chaos. He wore a tailored navy overcoat and held a leather satchel under his arm, glancing periodically at his nephew, Daniel, who stood beside him with a mixture of excitement and nervous energy. Daniel adjusted the strap of his messenger bag, the corner of an acceptance folder peeking from the zipper. He had barely slept the night before, too eager about the orientation ahead. At 19, with an early acceptance into the prestigious Langston Law Institute, he was stepping onto a path that his uncle had once walked decades earlier. Daniel admired Adrian deeply, his poise, his authority, and above all, his moral clarity. The judge was more than a guardian, he was a model of what justice could look like. Still, in that moment, Daniel felt small. The airport felt huge, noisy, and full of unfamiliar rules. He tugged at the collar of his coat, exhaling slowly. "You're fine," Adrian said quietly, his voice steady as stone but not unkind. "Breathe. Nothing's going to happen. Just stay close and follow instructions." Daniel nodded. "Right. I've got all my paperwork. Passport, admission letter, student ID." "You'll do just fine," Adrian interrupted with a small smile, patting Daniel's shoulder before shifting his gaze toward the security checkpoint. That was when he saw him, Officer Trent Mallory. Broad-shouldered, buzz-cut, and wearing the stiff uniform of an airport security agent. His eyes were sharp, but not in the way of careful observation. There was something else there, judgment maybe, or resentment. As Trent scanned the line of passengers, his gaze landed on Daniel. He didn't look away. Adrian's jaw tightened. His instincts, honed over 30 years of parsing body language in courtrooms and interrogation chambers, told him something was wrong. He leaned slightly toward Daniel and whispered low enough not to be heard, "Don't stray." "Something's off." Trent moved with unhurried purpose, weaving through stanchions and columns of travelers, making his way toward the checkpoint. He stopped briefly at the X-ray monitor, speaking in hushed tones to the guard behind it, before adjusting the sleeves of his uniform and turning back toward the line. His posture straightened. His eyes were still fixed on Daniel. Daniel, unaware of the full weight of the scrutiny, shifted nervously as he stepped forward. The bag slung over his shoulder was light, but it felt heavier with each step. He was rehearsing everything in his head. Take out laptop, remove shoes, nothing in pockets. Just follow the rules. Adrian's eyes never left Trent. As they approached the conveyor belt, a small commotion at the adjacent checkpoint drew momentary attention. A young boy had set off the metal detector with a belt buckle and his father was trying to calm him. While others turned toward the noise, Trent remained still, zeroed in on his target. Daniel placed his briefcase on the belt, then slipped off his shoes. As he moved toward the scanner arch, Trent stepped forward abruptly. "Hey, step back," Trent barked, his voice sharper than necessary. Daniel froze mid-step. I'm just—" "I said step back," Trent repeated, louder this time, glancing at another guard who instinctively looked away. Adrian stepped forward, calm but firm. "He's complying." "There's no need for that tone." Trent looked at the judge, his expression unreadable. "Standard procedure, sir?" "We do things by the book." Daniel stepped back as instructed, visibly rattled. Trent gestured for him to approach again, but this time with a smug grin just barely hidden behind regulation professionalism. "Bag on the belt, shoes off, jacket open, hands out," Trent said, each command delivered like a warning. "Let's see if you have anything that might concern national security." Daniel did as he was told, his fingers trembling slightly as he unzipped his bag and pulled out his documents. The admission letter slipped from his hands and fluttered to the ground. Trent scoffed audibly. "What's this? Another nervous scholar on his big day?" Daniel bent quickly to retrieve the letter, cheeks flushed. "I'm sorry, just nervous. That's all." Adrian's patience thinned. His voice dropped into the judicial cadence that had silenced courtrooms. "If you've identified a real threat, conduct your search. Otherwise, stop harassing him." Trent turned his head, slow and deliberate. "Everything will be conducted properly, sir," he said, though the undertone of mockery was unmistakable. His hand hovered near the chain of his cuffs, fingers wrapping idly around the metal. Adrian saw it. The way Trent's eyes lingered on Daniel, not scanning, but targeting. This wasn't protocol. This was personal. Nearby, passengers began to take notice. A man in business attire paused mid-text. A young couple slowed their pace as they passed the checkpoint. It was subtle, but the air had shifted. The hum of the airport dulled around them, thickened by tension that most couldn't name but instinctively sensed. Trent reached out and took Daniel's wallet from the inspection tray with unnecessary force, flipping it open as if expecting to find contraband within. "Identification." "Again," he said. "He already showed it," Adrian interjected. "I want to see it again." Daniel swallowed hard. "It's right there." "Inside the front slot." "I can see for myself," Trent snapped. Then, under his breath but loud enough for Adrian to hear, Trent muttered, "Always the privileged ones who think rules don't apply." The insult hung in the air like smoke. Adrian's hand tightened around the strap of his satchel, the muscles in his neck taut. He had faced murderers and liars in his courtroom. He had held the line against gangs, drug lords, and corporate sharks. But what stood in front of him now wasn't just a petty officer with a temper, it was a threat cloaked in uniform. He exhaled slowly. The line had not yet been crossed, but it was close. Daniel stood there, trying to hold himself still, his chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. The judge didn't move, but his voice reached across the small distance like a gavel drop. "Daniel," he said evenly, "stand right here." "Do not move," Trent gave a mocking shrug. No one's stopping him. No one was helping him either. As Daniel extended his arms for a second pat-down, the quiet around them grew louder than the announcements overhead. Every glance, every twitch of muscle, every drawn breath now felt like the prelude to something far greater, something dangerous. Adrian's gaze met Trent's, a silent warning flaring between them. But Trent didn't blink. His hand still played with the chain, knuckles white. The judge knew that in mere moments that chain would either fall harmlessly back into its holster or become a weapon. The judge, sensing unease, told Daniel quietly to stay close. Foreshadowing lingered in the air as Trent moved closer to the checkpoint with a strange intensity. What started as a simple trip was about to become a battle neither man could have imagined. Daniel stepped forward, the clatter of his dress shoes swallowed by the hum of Brenton International's busiest terminal. He approached the checkpoint with careful steps, balancing his briefcase and coat, every movement revealing a mix of excitement and nervousness. He had rehearsed this moment in his mind, his first flight alone, his first steps toward law school, his first goodbye to home. But all those thoughts dissolved when Officer Trent Mallory waved him forward with a sharp flick of his fingers and a cold, assessing stare that felt like it could pierce bone. "Bag on the scanner. Now!" Trent barked, his voice slicing through the air. Daniel obeyed instantly, placing the sleek black case on the conveyor belt. Judge Adrian Kessler stood just a step behind, eyes narrowed, his posture stiff. The judge had walked through enough rooms filled with liars and threats to know when something felt wrong, and this felt wrong. The way Trent looked at Daniel, not as a traveler but as a target, put the judge's instincts on high alert. "Shoes off," Trent snapped, barely giving Daniel time to react. Daniel fumbled with his laces, nearly tripping as he tried to balance and slide them off. His fingers trembled slightly, and the judge noticed. Not fear of flying, but of the man in front of him. Adrian stepped closer, close enough that his presence might discourage any further aggression. But Trent didn't back down. "Empty your pockets." "All of them." "Let's go," the officer pressed. Daniel obeyed, laying out his phone, wallet, boarding pass, and even a wrapped energy bar he had planned to eat on the plane. The items sat there like evidence on a courtroom table, harmless but displayed with an air of suspicion. Trent stared at them, then at Daniel, as if daring something to be wrong. "You traveling alone?" Trent asked, tone flat but edged with condescension. I'm going to orientation. My uncle is right behind me," Daniel replied, gesturing gently toward the judge. Trent didn't look. Instead, he leaned forward and muttered just loud enough for Adrian to hear. "Special treatment for privileged kids, huh?" The judge's jaw clenched. He stepped forward. "He's complied with every order." There's no need for commentary. Trent turned his head slightly but didn't meet Adrian's gaze. Instead, he extended a gloved hand and yanked Daniel's wallet from the tray with a quick, sharp movement. He flipped it open, examining the ID as if expecting to find forged documents. "Name's Daniel Kessler," Trent said aloud. "Any relation to the judge?" Adrian's voice remained calm but firm. "He's my nephew. He's going to law school." "Let's keep this professional." Trent's eyes flicked to Adrian's face, then back to Daniel, who now stood shoeless, his socks damp from the slick terminal floor. Trent looked at him like prey, like someone he could bend without consequence. "I'm going to need to pat him down," Trent announced, stepping forward abruptly. "You've scanned the bag." "You've seen the ID," Adrian said, trying to maintain control. "Is there a reason for a second check?" "No reason required," Trent replied, already pulling on the chain of his handcuffs, the steel links clinking menacingly as they unwound. "Random selection." The phrase echoed like a punch. Adrian had heard it 1,000 times in court, often hiding policies that weren't random at all. His instincts screamed now, not just as a judge, but as an uncle watching his blood be harassed without cause. "Officer," Adrian said, stepping between Daniel and the chain, "he's done nothing wrong." Trent didn't respond with words. Instead, he gripped the handcuff chain tighter in his fist, a subtle show of force. His smirk returned, a crooked expression of quiet dominance, as if this wasn't about security at all, but about power. And, in his mind, he had it. Daniel shifted uncomfortably. "Uncle Adrian." "I'm okay," he whispered, but his voice betrayed him. He wasn't okay. Around them, other passengers began to notice. A few paused mid-step. A woman with a toddler turned her head. A businessman slowed as he passed, glancing between the officer and the shoeless teenager. Something about the air had changed. Thicker. Charged. Then Trent spoke again, this time louder. "Is there a reason you're interfering with airport security protocol, sir?" "I'm interfering with intimidation," Adrian replied coolly, but his eyes had grown darker. "My nephew has followed every instruction. You're escalating without reason." Trent leaned closer to Daniel, who instinctively took a step back. "I'm not finished with him." And then Adrian saw it, the way Trent's fingers curled tighter around the chain, the way his stance widened. It wasn't over. It was just beginning. A split second of realization passed between uncle and nephew, like a silent alarm ringing in both their chests. Adrian's mind spun. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a tactic, a deliberate, calculated targeting. And it wasn't just about Daniel. It was about something more. Across the terminal, behind the checkpoint glass, another officer observed but didn't intervene. Adrian noticed the hesitation. This was not one man's cruelty. It was a pattern, an allowed behavior, a system left unchecked. Daniel flinched slightly as Trent stepped forward again, his boot brushing against the edge of Daniel's shoe tray. The tension peaked like the pause before a gavel strikes. Adrian's hand moved halfway forward, instinctively, protectively, and in that instant, he knew. This wouldn't end with words. He could feel it, like thunder behind glass, the pressure of injustice, the simmer of restraint reaching its limit. The silence of the terminal was about to break into violence. The moment shattered like glass. Daniel had just tried to pull his arm back, nothing aggressive, just a natural response to being shoved. But that slight movement was all it took to push Trent Mallory over the edge. With a snap of motion as fast as it was brutal, Trent raised the steel handcuff chain and swung it sideways like a flail. The metallic links cut the air with a sharp whistle before cracking against Daniel's forehead. The sound, flesh-meeting steel, echoed through the terminal louder than any announcement. A wet thud followed as Daniel dropped to his knees, both hands instinctively clutching his bleeding head. A wide gash opened above his right eyebrow, blood pouring down his face and dripping onto the polished tiles below. Passengers gasped. A woman near the scanner dropped her bag. Someone muttered, "Did he just hit that boy?" But the scene had already begun to morph into something surreal, like a courtroom suddenly turning into a battlefield. Judge Adrian Kessler stood frozen, his eyes locked on the red trail sliding down Daniel's cheek. Time seemed to stall. His nephew, his late brother's only son, his responsibility, was now bleeding on an airport floor under the so-called protection of law enforcement. Adrian's breath caught in his throat. His body remained still, but something inside him cracked open. He dropped to one knee beside Daniel, gripping the boy's shoulder gently. "Daniel," he whispered, eyes scanning his face. Daniel blinked slowly, his mouth opening as if to speak, but only a few weak words escaped. "I'm fine, Uncle." "Don't let him." Then silence. His head tipped slightly forward, consciousness slipping like sand through fingers. Adrian's hand clenched on Daniel's shoulder. The judge's mind reeled, flashes of trials he had presided over, men he had sentenced for crimes of violence, victims who had come seeking justice. He had always believed in process, in patience, in law. But now the law was watching his nephew bleed and doing nothing. Trent stood just feet away, his lips curled in a smirk, the handcuffs swinging lightly in his hand. His eyes locked onto the judge with mocking challenge. The look on his face said it all. He was proud of what he had done. "Problem, Judge?" Trent asked, voice low and soaked with arrogance. Adrian didn't respond. He couldn't. His thoughts had tunneled inward, drilling deep into the part of him that had long remained dormant. He had buried his fury for years, suppressed every urge to lash out during the most brutal trials. But now, with Daniel bleeding and Trent grinning, that control began to break apart. He looked up slowly, his eyes colder than the steel Trent was holding. Around them, passengers had pulled out their phones. Some recorded silently. Others whispered to one another, unsure whether to intervene or stay out of it. No one stepped forward. Not a single airport officer moved. They watched as though this were just another spectacle, one more viral moment in a world drowning in them. Adrian rose to his feet with deliberate calm, his hand brushing against his blazer pocket as if reaching for a verdict he'd already written. His fists curled tight, but he didn't move toward Trent. Not yet. The judge had never needed to shout. He commanded with presence. But now, even his silent authority wasn't enough. He glanced once more at Daniel, whose blood continued to trickle down to the floor, mixing with the shadow of the metal detector. That crimson stream ignited something deep inside him. Trent took a step forward, bouncing the handcuff chain in his palm. "He twitched, Judge." "That's resisting." "You know the rules." Adrian's voice was a whisper, but it landed like thunder. "You crossed a line." Trent scoffed. "You people think you can walk through here and get special treatment." That kid needed a reminder. Adrian didn't blink, didn't speak. But in his mind, something shifted. He saw the courtroom benches replaced by rows of passengers. The jury, now a crowd of silent witnesses. And the gavel. It had become the very chain Trent wielded like a weapon. One of the TSA agents took a step toward them, then froze. Maybe it was the way Adrian looked. Maybe it was the truth setting into the room. No one moved. Not yet. The judge's heart pounded, not from fear, but from fury. All the times he had warned officers in court against excessive force. All the judgments he had handed down against those who thought uniforms gave them immunity. Now the abuse was here, personal and bleeding on the floor in front of him. Daniel groaned softly, his body trembling. Adrian's jaw clenched. The tension in his body was no longer restrained. It coiled through his muscles like a storm waiting to strike. And in that moment, surrounded by silence, stares, and blood, he knew what had to be done. There would be no trial for Trent Mallory today. The trial had already begun. Adrian took one step forward, not rushed, not panicked, but firm, the kind of step that made people pause. Even Trent's smirk faltered. The judge looked him dead in the eye, and though he hadn't touched the chain yet, everyone watching could feel the shift in power. Somewhere deep in the back of the terminal, the PA system called out a gate number, but no one listened. Adrian lowered his eyes to Daniel one more time, then looked back at Trent. For the first time in decades, Adrian Kessler was not a judge, he was an avenger. Judge Adrian Kessler rose slowly from his crouched position beside Daniel, his frame towering over the chaos that had erupted. The chain still dangled from Officer Trent Mallory's gloved hand, links glinting like polished threats under the sterile overhead lights. Trent's smirk, smug, careless, the same one he wore while cracking Daniel's skull, still lingered, but only faintly. Adrian's eyes, dark with a fury he had not felt in years, locked onto that chain like a hawk to prey. His instincts didn't pause. His hands, once symbols of judgment from behind a bench, acted on a rawer form of justice. With a force that stunned everyone watching, Adrian seized the chain and ripped it from Trent's grasp. The sound was sharp and metallic, the gasp from the surrounding passengers even sharper. Trent staggered, caught off guard by the sudden reversal of control. Adrian didn't wait. With practiced hands and a judge's knowledge of pressure points, he whipped the chain in a fast loop around Trent's neck, jerking it tight before the officer could react. The steel links clinked and locked into position with a grim finality. Trent's eyes bulged, hands shooting up in instinctive panic. "What? What are you doing?" he wheezed, but his voice was choked off almost immediately. His boots scraped against the polished floor as he tried to gain footing, tried to reclaim the authority that had evaporated in seconds. Adrian stepped in close, his face inches from the officer's, every muscle in his body coiled like a spring. The smell of blood, metal, and stale airport air hung thick between them. "You raised your hand against my nephew," Adrian said in a voice that was low, steady, and terrifying in its calm. "Now, feel the weight of your own cruelty." Passengers all around were frozen, some with mouths open, some fumbling with phones, capturing every frame. Security alarms had started blaring from somewhere in the distance, red lights flashing overhead, but no backup had arrived yet. No one rushed forward to stop the judge. Not yet. Daniel, still on the floor, blinked against the blood seeping toward his right eye. Through his blurred vision, he watched his uncle, his calm, iron-willed mentor, transform before his eyes into something unrecognizable. Not reckless, not uncontrolled, but primal. As if years of watching injustice pass through his courtroom had finally broken the dam inside him. He tried to speak, but only a hoarse sound came out. Trent clawed desperately at the chain, his fingers slipping against the cold metal. "You're assaulting an officer," he croaked. "You're no officer," Adrian replied, eyes burning. "You're a disgrace in uniform." The crowd tensed, unsure what they were witnessing, an act of unlawful rage or long-overdue justice. A mother pulled her child close, shielding his eyes. A man in a business suit whispered, "That kid's bleeding out and no one's stopping it." Another muttered, "He deserves it." I saw it all. Everyone became a jury without a courtroom. Adrian didn't care. He felt the tremble in Trent's knees as the man weakened. He saw the shift in dominance, the subtle change in the officer's face, not just pain now, but fear. Real, humbling fear. For the first time in who knew how long, Trent Mallory was no longer in control of anyone. The judge leaned in closer, tightening the chain half an inch more, forcing Trent down slightly. "Every inch of power you use to belittle others," Adrian said, his voice heavy, "will be used to bring you to your knees." A long, crackling voice buzzed from the radios clipped to the belts of idle officers nearby, but no one moved. Not a single colleague came to Mallory's aid. Some watched with cold expressions, others looked away. It was as though the entire terminal had entered a trance, one part silent outrage, one part sacred witnessing. From the floor, Daniel finally found strength to speak. "Uncle," he rasped, voice trembling. "Don't." Stoop to his level. Adrian hesitated. For a split second, Daniel's words pierced the fog of rage clouding his mind. But as he looked down at the blood covering Daniel's shirt, his face split open. A life nearly ended over nothing. The hesitation passed. "This isn't stooping," Adrian whispered back without turning his gaze from Trent. "This is standing up." Trent gave one last feeble tug at the chain, then slumped slightly, breathing shallow and ragged. His mouth opened and closed without words. Adrian stared him down, eyes never blinking until a distant clang echoed, gates opening, footsteps coming. The reinforcements would be there soon. But Adrian didn't flinch. He wanted them to see. He wanted every man who wore the same uniform as Trent to understand what happened when the law became a shield for bullies. In that moment, he wasn't thinking like a judge. Not anymore. He was a guardian, a witness, a man tired of watching cowards hide behind rules they didn't follow themselves. And so, with alarms wailing and eyes locked on him, Adrian spoke the words that cut louder than sirens and sharper than steel. "This is what happens when you abuse power." Adrian Kessler's grip tightened, the cold links of the handcuff chain biting into his palm as they pressed deeper into Trent's neck. The officer's arrogant facade had vanished, replaced by wide, panicked eyes and the shallow, desperate wheeze of someone tasting the edge of unconsciousness. All around them, the airport terminal buzzed with whispers and shaky phone recordings. Some passengers stared in horror, others murmured approval beneath their breath, their gazes flicking between the blood on Daniel's shirt and the fury on the judge's face. Adrian's knuckles whitened as he pulled the chain slightly tighter, his breath ragged, not from exhaustion, but from the violent weight of betrayal. He had spent decades preaching discipline from the bench, demanding accountability without ever raising his voice. But now, in the middle of Gate B-17, he stood not as a judge in robes, but as a man who had seen too much. He looked down at Daniel, still unconscious, blood painting a dark streak across his temple, and something inside him snapped further. How many times had he seen families walk into his courtroom broken by the unchecked power of a uniform? How many victims had pleaded for someone to protect them before it was too late? Trent gagged again, his fingers clawing at the chain, but Adrian didn't flinch. The noise of the terminal receded into a low hum. His entire focus had narrowed to the man in front of him, the man who had slammed steel into his nephew's skull as casually as someone would swat a fly. There was no room for mercy. Not yet. "Look at him," Adrian growled through clenched teeth, his voice low and trembling with controlled rage. "Look what you did." Trent didn't respond. Couldn't respond, but his eyes flicked toward Daniel. For the first time, Adrian saw something unfamiliar in them: regret, or maybe just fear. The chain shifted in his hands as Adrian adjusted his grip, preparing for whatever would come next. And then, from the edge of the crowd, a voice cut through the silence with unexpected force. "Stop! He's not acting alone!" Adrian froze. The chain loosened just enough for Trent to gasp desperately. The crowd parted as a tall man in a gray coat stepped forward, his voice clear and urgent. His hair was dark, neatly combed, and his face bore the calm intensity of someone who had waited for this moment. "I've been watching him," the man said, raising his hands in a gesture of peace. "My name's Patrick Cole. I'm a private investigator. That man, Trent, he's not working alone." The name struck Adrian like a jolt. Patrick Cole. The name sounded vaguely familiar, someone who had submitted evidence once in a civil corruption case, but this wasn't the time for memory games. Adrian's breathing slowed, his grip still firm on the chain, but the heat behind his eyes had shifted from pure rage to calculated focus. "What are you talking about?" Adrian asked, his voice steady now but still edged with steel. Patrick stepped closer, slowly, so the judge wouldn't mistake him for a threat. His coat flared slightly with each step, revealing a badge clipped inside, independent investigator credentials, official, and time-stamped. "He's part of a network," Patrick explained quickly. "They call it the green tag system. Unofficial, off the books. It's a list created by certain security personnel, people in this airport who target passengers, especially young men, traveling alone. They harass them, extort them, and in some cases, worse." Adrian's eyes narrowed, his pulse quickening again. "You expect me to believe this is some kind of organized operation?" "I don't expect you to believe anything," Patrick replied, "but I've been building this case for months. Trent is just one pawn. There are supervisors, shift managers, even people in the administration who are covering it up. Your nephew was green-tagged the moment he walked in." The judge turned his head slowly toward Trent. The officer's face had lost all color. He looked away, shame flickering across his features. That alone was answer enough. The metal in Adrian's hand felt heavier now, not just a weapon, but a symbol of something much bigger than a single act of violence. He looked down at Daniel again. The boy's breathing was shallow, but steady. A trail of blood curved around his jawline like a cruel signature left by corruption. "You said they tag young men?" Adrian asked, eyes still fixed on Trent. Patrick nodded. "Solo travelers. Students. Sometimes immigrants. Anyone they think won't fight back. They use fake security alerts to pull them aside, intimidate them, or charge them bogus fines." The judge let out a slow, shaky breath. Every instinct he had, every ounce of judicial training and courtroom wisdom, had prepared him to recognize patterns of abuse. But this wasn't just abuse. It was systemic cruelty, hidden behind the badges of authority. "Why hasn't anyone stopped it?" he demanded. "I tried," Patrick said, "but no one listened. I needed something undeniable, something public." Adrian realized the awful truth. He and Daniel had become the evidence, the blood on the tiles. The cameras pointed their way, the fear in Trent's eyes. This wasn't the beginning of a problem. It was a crack in a dam that had been ready to burst. The passengers stood in silence, the weight of Patrick's words settling over them. Phones still recorded. Some men exchanged glances, fathers clutched their sons' shoulders, travelers hugged their bags tighter. The terminal had turned into a courtroom without walls. Adrian's jaw tightened. The rage hadn't vanished, it had evolved. Now it had purpose. He leaned slightly toward Trent, his voice low and cold. "Is he telling the truth?" he asked. Trent didn't answer, but he didn't deny it either. That silence said everything. Adrian turned to Patrick. You stay with me. If there's a list, we're going to find it, and we're going to bury everyone who signed off on it. Patrick nodded, his face firm. I've got names. Files. Evidence stashed away. But if we don't act now, they'll start erasing it. Adrian glanced again at the trail of blood behind Daniel, at the faces of the crowd, at the camera lights glowing like eyes in a courtroom gallery. He knew this was no longer about Daniel alone. He could feel the weight of something vast, something rotten, pressing in around them, and then, with cold clarity, the thought struck him. The blood on the floor was only the beginning of something much darker. The chain slackened slightly, just enough to keep Trent from passing out. Judge Adrian Kessler's knuckles were white around the metal links, his grip still firm, but no longer vengeful. His pulse thundered in his ears, not from exertion, but from the weight of something far more dangerous than a violent officer: truth. The kind that infected institutions, the kind that festered behind closed doors and innocent uniforms. Around him, the terminal remained suspended in eerie stillness. Travelers clutched their phones mid-recording, frozen between fear and fascination. The buzz of conveyor belts, the ding of gate announcements, everything had dimmed beneath the spectacle unfolding before them. Daniel stirred on the cold tile floor beside him, blood still tracing a cruel path down his forehead. He tried to push himself up with trembling hands, eyes glassy but focused. "Uncle," he rasped, barely audible over the silence. "I heard him say something, before he hit me, something about a green tag list." The words sliced through Adrian's thoughts like a blade. He looked down at Trent, whose face was now flushed red from restrained breath, his expression unchanged, a smirk still playing faintly at the corners of his lips. The arrogance in that expression was louder than any words he could have spoken. Patrick Cole stepped closer. "He's not the only one," the investigator said, voice low but urgent. "This isn't personal. It's coordinated." Adrian turned his head slowly toward Patrick. The crowd watched, hushed and breathless like an audience awaiting a verdict. "Explain," the judge demanded, his tone like stone grinding against steel. Patrick gave a wary glance around, his eyes scanning the terminal as if expecting shadows to move. "They call it the green tag list," he began, voice just loud enough for those nearby to hear. "Unofficial, of course, created by someone high up in the airport security division. It's not on any database that can be audited, just names, passengers flagged for special handling. Mostly young men, often traveling alone. Sometimes they're profiled. Sometimes they're targeted because someone's expecting a bribe. But always, it ends in silence." Adrian's eyes narrowed, the metal chain twitching slightly in his hands. He could feel Trent's shallow breaths under his grip, but it was the smirk, unchanging, smug, that confirmed it all. "You're telling me my nephew was assaulted as part of a protocol?" Adrian asked coldly. Patrick nodded. "Not protocol. A pattern. A system. And Trent here. He's proud of it." Trent wheezed slightly but gave no denial. His eyes glinted with something between mockery and defiance, as if daring Adrian to take it further. That look told the judge everything he needed to know. Trent wasn't just following orders, he was enjoying them. Daniel coughed weakly and added, "He said something about next in line, like I was one of many." Adrian's chest tightened. A part of him, the rational legal mind honed over decades, wanted to stop, to step back and assess the evidence. But another part, older and deeper, surged like a tide. This wasn't about a courtroom anymore. This was about the rot beneath the floorboards, the kind that grew when no one dared to peel back the layers. He looked at Trent again. "Who controls the list?" No answer, just that same smirk. Adrian pulled the chain just enough to press the question physically. Trent choked slightly but still said nothing. The silence became a second confession, more damning than words. Patrick leaned closer. "I've been tracking this for months. The problem is, every time I get close, the trail disappears. Logs are erased, complaints never leave the terminal, and the few victims who speak up? Threatened, paid off, or labeled disruptive." Adrian's grip hardened again. "Not this time." Patrick nodded, eyes flashing. "That's why I stepped in. You're the first man with enough voice and visibility to drag this into daylight." The crowd began to stir again. Whispers, murmurs, shifting stances. Phones remained high, still recording, but the bystanders were no longer merely witnesses. They were becoming participants, observers of a reckoning that seemed to grow bigger by the second. Adrian straightened, taking a deep breath as his eyes scanned the perimeter of the terminal. He could feel the atmosphere changing. Somewhere, someone in that chain of command had already been alerted. If Trent was a pawn, then the king was watching now. "What happens next?" Adrian asked Patrick without taking his eyes off Trent. Patrick's jaw tightened. "That depends on how far you're willing to go, Judge." Adrian didn't hesitate. "All the way." The smirk on Trent's face twitched, just for a moment. A flicker of doubt. A seed of fear. Daniel tried to sit up again, this time leaning against a nearby column. "Uncle, don't let him walk away from this." Adrian glanced down, his voice quiet but resolute. "He won't." He turned back to Patrick. "You said others are involved?" "Who else?" Before Patrick could answer, Trent gave a slow, rattling chuckle under the chain's pressure. "You'll never reach them," he muttered, hoarse and bitter. "They're already watching you." Adrian leaned closer, speaking just above a whisper. "Then let them watch. I want them to see what happens when justice is no longer chained to silence." Around them, the tension in the terminal thickened, an invisible weight pressing against every breath. The quiet was no longer passive, it was suspenseful, ready to snap. Adrian could feel it in his bones. This wasn't just about Daniel anymore. This wasn't about one chain or one officer. It was about all the names on that list. He tightened the grip once more, and with cold clarity in his voice he said, "The judge realized he was not just avenging his nephew. He was about to unravel a conspiracy rooted in the heart of the airport." Security laughed, blind to the black robes watching from the shadows. A judge's patience is long, but when the gavel falls, justice strikes harder than steel. If you stand for accountability, hit subscribe now. The sound of approaching boots shattered the silence like a sudden clap of thunder. Judge Adrian Kessler didn't flinch. His grip remained firm, the cold metal chain wrapped around Officer Trent Mallory's neck trembling slightly with each shallow breath the man took. Then they appeared, 4 uniformed officers cutting through the gathering crowd, their eyes scanning the chaos, their expressions unreadable. At their front strode a tall, commanding figure, Captain Gerald Rourke, the head of Brenton International Airport Security. Rourke's eyes locked onto Trent first, still hunched, red-faced and gasping under the tightening chain, then shifted to Adrian. The captain's brow furrowed slightly, not in confusion but calculation. There was no shock on his face, no outrage, only the cold flicker of recognition, and then something else. A warning. "Everyone stand down," Rourke barked, his voice steady and firm but lacking conviction. He raised a single hand to his men. The officers slowed but did not lower their hands from their sidearms. The terminal felt like it had fallen under a spell. Every breath from the passengers held like glass about to shatter. Adrian studied Rourke with practiced eyes. Years on the bench had taught him how to read liars, manipulators, and men who thought they were above the law. Rourke's stance was too casual, too rehearsed. He wasn't there to stop the violence, he was there to control the fallout. That flicker behind the captain's eyes gave it away. Rourke knew exactly who Trent was and what he had done. And more than that, Rourke had expected this moment. Daniel stirred at Adrian's side, still bleeding from the gash across his forehead, his breath shallow but determined. "Uncle." "Don't let them twist it," he muttered, barely loud enough to hear. Adrian didn't take his eyes off Rourke. "I won't," he said flatly, his voice like steel drawn from a sheath. Then Patrick Cole, the private investigator, moved to Adrian's flank, just a few steps from the officers. He spoke with calm purpose, loud enough to ensure the dozens of passengers filming heard every syllable. "The judge knows the truth now," he said, eyes locked on Rourke. The effect was immediate. Some passengers gasped, others raised their phones higher, realizing they were not just recording a violent altercation, they were witnessing an exposure. Rourke stepped forward, slowly, his hands held out in a non-threatening gesture. "Judge Kessler," he said, his voice now laced with diplomatic tension, "you've made your point. Let's handle this the right way. You're a man of law. Don't let this go further." The implication stung. Adrian narrowed his eyes. "The right way," he repeated, his tone cutting. "My nephew is bleeding because your officer used a weapon instead of words." "He resisted," Rourke replied almost too quickly. "No," Adrian snapped. "He stood still while a man who wears your badge treated him like an enemy." Rourke's mouth twitched, just slightly. His mask almost slipped. The other officers shifted uncomfortably. None dared to speak. None dared to act. Whatever confidence they had arrived with had eroded beneath the weight of dozens of camera lenses and a judge who held the chain of justice quite literally in his hand. "I'm not releasing him," Adrian said firmly, giving the chain a slight tug, enough to make Trent cough. "Not until someone gives me a reason why my nephew was targeted. Why he was assaulted." Rourke took another step. "We don't want this to escalate. Let's move to a private space." "No," Patrick interrupted, stepping between them. "We're staying right here. The public needs to see this. The media needs to see this." Rourke's face hardened. "You're making a mistake, Judge." Adrian tilted his head slightly, lowering his voice just enough to make his words personal. "The mistake was thinking you could hide behind your uniform forever." Daniel winced, shifting to sit more upright. He touched the side of his face and stared at the red smudge that came away on his fingers. His eyes, bloodshot but burning with clarity, turned to the captain. "There's a list," he said hoarsely. "Trent mentioned it." A green tag. Rourke's jaw tightened. "A list?" Adrian asked, his mind sharpening. He turned to Trent, who avoided eye contact, sweat running down his temples. Patrick leaned closer to Adrian, his voice low. "It's real. They've been using it to harass and extort. Mostly young men traveling alone. Anyone they think won't fight back." Adrian stared at Rourke. "Is that why you're really here, Captain?" "Not to protect the terminal, but the list." Rourke didn't answer. The tension snapped tighter. The crowd, though silent, was pressing closer. Passengers whispered to each other. One man said, "I was treated like that last month." Another, "They pulled my son for no reason, too." The murmurs grew. Adrian's fingers clenched the chain a little tighter. He didn't care about protocol anymore. Not here. Not now. Rourke shifted again, glancing sideways at one of his officers, just a flick of the eyes, but Adrian saw it. He wasn't just assessing the situation. He was stalling, waiting for something, or someone. Adrian's gut churned with realization. "This isn't about an out-of-control officer," he said aloud. "This is about a system. A machine that punishes the powerless and protects itself." No one responded, but no one denied it either. Adrian felt the shift. The silence wasn't confusion anymore. It was fear. Fear of the truth being dragged out of the shadows. The judge looked once more at the man gasping beneath the chain, then at the crowd watching in stunned silence, then at the man who thought he was still in control. In that fragile stillness, Adrian thought, he sensed that the true enemy was already tightening an invisible noose around him. The chain slipped. Adrian felt the sharp jab of Trent's elbow slam into his ribs, forcing the breath from his lungs in a sudden grunt. Pain flared, but his grip faltered only for a moment, long enough for Trent to twist free and collapse forward onto the terminal floor, coughing violently, one hand clawing at his bruised neck. The metal handcuffs clattered against the tiles as they slipped from Adrian's hand. A breathless hush overtook the terminal. The tension wound so tightly it could snap at any second. "Now!" Rourke barked, his voice cutting through the moment like a blade. The security officers surged forward, boots thudding, weapons unholstered, not guns, but reinforced batons and tasers drawn from their belts with grim efficiency. Adrian didn't hesitate. With the speed of a man half his age, he snatched the chain from the floor, stepped in front of his nephew's crumpled form, and raised the metal high again. It wasn't a bluff. The look in his eyes warned them. "Come closer, and you will be stopped." The advancing officers froze mid-step. Shouts erupted from the crowd, the dam of silence breaking at last. "Back off," someone yelled. "He's defending that kid," another cried. Some voices begged Adrian to stop, others urged him to stand strong. Phones stayed raised, the recording lights like a constellation of accountability around them. The crowd's energy surged like an approaching storm, raw, unpredictable, and impossible to ignore. Patrick's voice pierced through it all. "Tell them, Rourke. Tell them about the green tag list. You run it, don't you?" All heads turned. Rourke's eyes narrowed, his jaw tightened. The confident authority that had wrapped around him like armor now looked brittle, cracking. He didn't answer, but he didn't deny it either. He stood still, too still, and that stillness spoke volumes. Adrian's sharp eyes locked onto him and saw it. Fear behind the silence, truth behind the mask. Daniel stirred behind him. Slowly, he pushed himself to his knees, blood still trickling down the side of his face, tracing a cruel line from his brow to his collar. He tried to speak but coughed instead, pain slicing through his voice. Still he rose, shoulders trembling, his young frame swaying under the weight of injury and adrenaline. "Uncle," he whispered hoarsely, reaching for Adrian's coat. But then, with a sudden strength summoned from somewhere deeper than pain, Daniel took one step forward, stood upright, and faced the crowd. His voice, though cracked, rang clear. "If you silence him," he said, eyes locked on Rourke, "you silence the court itself." The words struck the crowd like a gavel hitting wood. For a moment, everything froze. Even the officers who had advanced stopped breathing. It wasn't just a statement, it was a sentence passed. Spoken not by a judge, but by a boy still bleeding, whose only crime was having hope and dignity. Adrian felt the words like a surge in his chest, pride swelling, fury sharpening. He turned toward Trent, who lay wheezing on the floor, and stepped forward with slow, deliberate intent. He looped the chain again, once, twice around the man's neck, just tight enough to remind him who was in control. Trent flinched, weakly trying to pull away, but Adrian leaned in close. "Say it," Adrian commanded, voice low, grave, and unshakable. "Say the operation exists. Right here. Right now." Trent looked around as if still hoping someone would save him, but no help came. Rourke remained silent. The officers did nothing. And the crowd, they waited, not for blood, but for truth. Trent croaked, then swallowed. "I was following orders." "Whose orders?" Adrian pressed, tightening the chain just slightly. Trent gasped. "Rourke's. The list's real. Green tags, targeted passengers, harassment, all of it." The confession echoed across the concourse, caught on dozens of phones recorded from every angle. Shock rippled through the passengers. Some cried out in disbelief. Others shook their heads, murmuring with growing fury. It was no longer just about Daniel, no longer about one attack. This was systemic, intentional, a machine of cruelty built into the walls of the airport. Adrian slowly released the pressure, letting Trent slump down fully, coughing on the floor. The judge turned to the crowd, scanning the faces around him. His own face, lined with years of legal battles and restrained fury, was now alive with something else, resolve born not from the bench, but from blood. And yet, even in that moment of victory, Adrian knew the fight wasn't over. He could feel it, like a shadow curling just out of view. The confession was only the beginning. The system that had allowed this had layers, faces hidden behind badges and boardroom doors. He had pulled the curtain back on one man, but how many stood behind him? Still, he had started something that couldn't be stopped. The crowd had witnessed it. The footage was real. The confession had been spoken aloud, in public, under the eye of the law and the lens of the people. The first domino had fallen, but the judge knew the storm was far from over. Trent's strangled confession still hung in the air, echoing in the breathless silence of the terminal. His voice had cracked beneath the weight of the chain and the pressure of truth, and in that moment, Adrian Kessler knew rage alone would not bring justice. Rage had cracked open the lies, yes, but it would take something colder, sharper, and more deliberate to tear down the whole structure built atop those lies. He couldn't just fight, he had to outthink them. And that started now. Adrian leaned toward Patrick Cole, keeping his voice low and firm. "Tell them to keep filming," he said. "Get the videos online. Every angle, every word. If the outside world sees this, they can't erase it." Patrick nodded quickly, understanding without needing more explanation. He slipped into the crowd like a trained shadow, moving between clusters of passengers who still had their phones out, many of them stunned into silence. The lights overhead buzzed softly, a stark contrast to the storm brewing just below them. Outside the tall windows, planes taxied quietly, oblivious to the war of principle unfolding inside. Rourke stepped forward, breaking the quiet with a voice that was carefully modulated, too careful, too smooth. "Judge Kessler," he began, "I urge you to let Officer Mallory go. I'll see to it your nephew receives the medical attention he needs." Immediately, Adrian's head turned slowly, his expression unreadable. His fingers flexed once around the chain still looped around Trent's neck. The young officer whimpered but didn't resist. "You'll see to it?" Adrian repeated, his voice like a judge reading a sentence from the bench. "Was it your compassion that watched him bleed on the floor? Or your mercy that left him unconscious while your men stood and did nothing?" Rourke opened his mouth to reply, but didn't. Adrian could see the gears turning behind those eyes, calculating, stalling, reaching for leverage that no longer existed. "You think I'm going to trade justice for a bandage?" Adrian added, louder now, and some of the passengers murmured in agreement. He straightened and addressed the entire crowd. "No, we don't need secret backroom promises. We need the truth, and the only place that truth can survive is in the open." The judge turned back to Rourke. "I want a full escort to the nearest press station in this airport. I will speak to the media, on record, in front of cameras." For the first time, Rourke hesitated, not because he feared the judge, but because he feared the optics. The room was full of witnesses. Too many phones, too many angles. If Adrian made it to the press, this wouldn't just be a scandal, it would be a reckoning. "No press," Rourke said stiffly. "Let's resolve this, quietly." Adrian didn't respond. Instead, he adjusted his grip on the chain, not to strangle, but to declare he still held control. With his other arm, he helped Daniel to his feet. The boy groaned softly, blood still painting one side of his face, but he nodded at his uncle. He was ready. Without waiting for permission, Adrian began walking. His steps were slow but deliberate. Trent stumbled along in front of him, the chain tight around his neck like a leash. Daniel limped at his side, holding his head high despite the pain. The crowd around them parted instinctively, not out of fear, but out of respect. Every eye followed them. Every phone stayed raised. Every heart beat a little faster, watching a man who had once passed judgment from a bench now march through the airport with the very weight of justice in his hands. Rourke moved to stop him. "This isn't how things are done, Judge." Adrian paused, tilting his head just slightly. "It is today." Behind him, Patrick had already begun whispering into the ears of the passengers, sharing what he knew, urging them to keep spreading the videos. The online uploads had begun. One young man in a red hoodie confirmed it aloud. "It's already posted. It's got views. Hundreds. No, thousands. People are commenting. It's real now." Rourke paled, but Adrian didn't look back. As they passed through the central corridor, flight announcements echoed overhead, dissonant reminders of a world still pretending this was a normal day. But nothing was normal. The floor, once gleaming, was now streaked with blood. The air, once filled with idle chatter and boarding calls, now held history in the making. A man in a business suit moved aside and whispered, "God bless you, Judge." A security trainee lowered his eyes and stepped back, as if ashamed to wear the same uniform Trent once did. The passengers weren't just witnesses anymore. They were part of it, carried along by the current of justice. The terminal had become something else, a courtroom, and at its center walked Adrian Kessler, chain in one hand, his broken nephew at his side, and the truth wrapped tightly around them both. The airport had become a courtroom, and Adrian Kessler was delivering the verdict. The concourse pulsed with tension as Judge Adrian Kessler led the makeshift procession through the heart of Brenton International. His left arm stayed tight around his bloodied nephew's shoulders, helping Daniel limp forward, while his right hand gripped the chain still wrapped around Trent Mallory's neck. The officer stumbled with every step, no longer defiant, reduced now to a gasping symbol of everything Adrian was fighting against. Passengers moved aside as the trio passed, their faces a mixture of shock, awe, and rising fury. Phones were raised, recording from every angle. The overhead speakers continued to announce gate changes and boarding calls, but no one listened anymore. The airport had become a battleground of truth. Patrick Cole reappeared through a side corridor, weaving past stunned travelers. His voice was low but urgent as he stepped beside Adrian. "The videos are up, already viral. Major outlets are picking them up. It's spreading like wildfire." Adrian didn't answer immediately. He stared straight ahead at the wall of flight information monitors, flickering like the nerves in his spine. Relief washed over him for a moment, but so did danger. Visibility was a shield, but also a target. Now that the world was watching, the enemy would be desperate, and desperate men made reckless choices. Suddenly, a new voice broke the buzz of whispers. "Judge Kessler." Adrian turned slightly. Officer Grady, one of Rourke's own men, had stepped out of formation. His hand was raised, not in aggression, but in declaration. The crowd hushed. Even the terminal announcement seemed to fade. "I need to speak," Grady said, his voice loud enough to echo. He looked young, maybe 30, his uniform crisp, but his eyes hollowed by months of silence. Rourke's head snapped toward him. "Grady, fall back in line," he barked. Grady didn't move. His voice quivered but held firm. "I can't do it anymore. I was given orders. Orders to target passengers on a list. A list marked green tag. We weren't supposed to ask questions, just follow protocol. Harass, isolate, escalate if needed. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Adrian stood still, chain frozen in his grasp. His heartbeat thundered. This was confirmation on record in front of witnesses. I was told it was for security enhancement, but it wasn't. We hurt people. People like him, Grady said, pointing at Daniel, and I stayed quiet. Until now. Rourke turned pale, his grip tightening around his baton, but he didn't move. He saw it too, the crowd shifting, murmuring. Passengers were no longer just observers. They were becoming participants. I'll testify, Grady continued, stepping closer to Adrian. If you can protect me, I'll stand beside you. I'll name names. Adrian's eyes locked on the young officer. He saw fear, yes, but also something rare, remorse. You'll have protection, Adrian said, his voice calm but carrying. And you'll help bring this rot to light. Rourke took a step forward. Judge, release Trent. Your nephew needs medical help. This has gone far enough. Adrian turned to face him fully, his voice rising with each word. You watched him bleed. You did nothing. You gave these orders. You watched power twist into violence. Rourke bristled. And what are you now? A vigilante with a chain? Adrian's voice dropped, cold and deliberate. No, I'm a man who remembers what justice looks like. He tightened the chain just enough that Trent winced, a visible reminder of who now held the authority. The law belongs to the people, Adrian declared, his voice ringing across the concourse, not to corrupt men hiding in uniforms. The crowd roared. People clapped, shouted, lifted their phones higher. Rourke looked around, sweat beading on his temple. He had lost the room, lost the control he had held for years behind bureaucratic walls and sealed files. Patrick leaned close again. They're not going to let this go quietly. Not after that confession. We need to move, get to the press lounge, cameras, live feed. Once this is broadcast, they can't spin it. Adrian nodded slightly, guiding Daniel forward once more. Trent, gasping, stumbled behind him. Grady moved alongside, hand on his holster, not in threat, but in protection. Other officers hesitated, unsure where loyalty lay now. But in the shadows of the upper concourse, behind tinted observation glass and silent corridors, figures watched. Men who hadn't worn uniforms in years. Men with contracts, control codes, and clearance levels. They saw the chain. They saw the crowd. And they began to move. But in the shadows above the concourse, unseen figures were already preparing their counterstrike. The hidden doors near the security office hissed open with a faint click, almost swallowed by the sounds of the crowded concourse. Almost. Judge Adrian Kessler turned instinctively, his senses razor-sharp from years of dissecting courtroom lies and danger cloaked in politeness. But this wasn't a courtroom. This was a battleground, and the threat wasn't subtle anymore. From the shadowed hallway stepped 6 men in plainclothes, clean-shaven, silent, and moving with alarming coordination. Their eyes swept the area like floodlights, cold and calculating. No name tags, no hesitation. They weren't airport security. They were something else. Their stiff movements and tight formations made it clear they were enforcers, brought in not to de-escalate, but to erase. Loose ends, witnesses, anyone in their way. The crowd sensed it too. Murmurs surged like static through the terminal. Phones stopped recording for a moment, not out of fear, but confusion. Who were these men? Why were they here now? Adrian's grip on the chain around Trent Mallory's neck tightened, the cold metal digging into the officer's skin. Trent wheezed but didn't dare move. Adrian's eyes never left the advancing operatives. His mind raced, piecing together the play. These weren't backup, they were the counterstrike. Patrick Cole, ever perceptive, leaned in and whispered with urgency, his eyes darting between the approaching figures. They're not here to talk. These guys are cleanup. They'll eliminate you, me, Daniel, anyone who knows about the list. Adrian didn't flinch. His jaw clenched with quiet fury. A lifetime of legal wisdom eclipsed by something older and deeper, instinct. His nephew stood beside him, swaying on weakened legs, blood drying in a jagged streak down his cheek. Daniel didn't say a word. His silence wasn't weakness. It was resolve. The operatives moved as one, fanning out. One placed a hand on his belt, just a twitch, but enough. Adrian's pulse pounded in his ears. His voice was low, calm, but cut like a blade. Don't take another step." The chain tensed, but before the moment could snap, Officer Grady, a name few had cared about minutes ago, stepped forward with a force that shook the ground beneath their feet. "Stop, right there," he barked, voice booming across the terminal. All eyes turned. His service weapon was drawn, not trembling but firm, aimed directly at the lead operative. His stance was wide, planted like a tree refusing to fall in a storm. The plainclothes agents froze for a breath, then recalculated. Grady didn't lower his voice. "Anyone moves on him," he gestured to Adrian. "They answer to me." It was a declaration not just of loyalty, but of truth. The mask of fear shattered. In an instant, the atmosphere shifted. Passengers gasped. The sound of dozens of camera phones powering back on filled the air with an electric crackle. A boy, no older than 12, whispered, "That's the guy who spoke up earlier." Another man, near Gate 12, raised his phone and shouted, "We're with the judge!" And then it began, a ripple that became a wave. The crowd, once a passive audience, erupted. "Justice! Justice!" The chant roared to life. "Justice! Justice!" It echoed through the vaulted ceilings of the terminal like a thunderclap. People pressed forward, not aggressively but with united purpose. Cameras up, eyes open, the operatives hesitated. They were trained for silence, not spotlights. Daniel, shaky but unafraid, raised his voice. "You think you can hide behind suits and silence, but now everyone sees you." One of the operatives tried to radio in, but the signal crackled with interference, drowned by the chorus of voices growing louder with every second. Patrick, standing behind Adrian, raised both arms, calling out, "They're here to cover it all up. Don't let them." Adrian tightened the chain, not to choke, but to remind Trent that the world was watching now. The silence he'd once relied on was gone. The secrets were breaking open. For a moment, no one moved. It was a standoff of a different kind. Not bullets, not fists, but truth versus control. The operatives, dressed in blankness, realized the tide had shifted. If they attacked now, they wouldn't be suppressing a riot. They'd be igniting a revolution. Adrian turned slightly toward the cameras and spoke, his voice strong and steady. "Let the world see what corruption looks like when it's dragged into the light." Trent whimpered beneath the chain, his defiance shattered. Rourke was nowhere to be seen, and the operatives, sensing the winds had turned, began to step back, not in surrender, but in retreat. Grady kept his weapon up, his arms trembling now with adrenaline. "They're backing off, but they'll try again." Adrian nodded. "Let them. But next time, we'll be ready." And as the agents disappeared into the shadows from where they came, the chants continued to roll like thunder. "Justice! Justice!" The people weren't afraid anymore. The walls of corruption trembled as truth and courage collided in the open. Rourke's eyes flared with desperation as the chants swelled around him, a thunderous rhythm of "Justice! Justice!" echoing through the vaulted ceilings of Brenton International's central concourse. He had watched his command crumble in minutes, his officers wavering, his lies unraveling, and now his authority bleeding out in front of hundreds of witnesses. He saw Adrian Kessler, standing tall with the chain still clutched in one fist, and beside him, Daniel, young, wounded, and defiant. Rourke's pride and panic fused into one final, reckless decision. Without warning, he lunged forward, elbowing past the men who once obeyed his every word. His hand shot toward Daniel, fingers outstretched, intent on dragging the boy back like a bargaining chip. The move was fast, brutal, and instinctual, but it wasn't fast enough. Adrian didn't think. He reacted. With the speed of a gavel strike, he tore the chain from Trent's neck and swung it in a wide, sharp arc. The metallic links cut through the air and cracked across Rourke's face with a sickening snap. The force knocked the captain off his feet. Blood bloomed instantly across his cheek and brow, tracing down like ink on parchment. He staggered, his eyes wide in stunned disbelief, collapsing backward into the arms of two stunned security officers who neither caught him gracefully nor helped him rise. The crowd gasped in a single, collective breath, and then fell deathly silent for a heartbeat. Daniel, knocked off balance in the scuffle, collapsed into his uncle's arms. His breathing was shallow, his skin pale, but he was safe. Adrian knelt quickly, steadying his nephew with one arm while the other still clutched the bloodied chain. His chest heaved with adrenaline, but his expression was carved from granite, cold, focused, unwavering. Across the marble floor, Trent Mallory, once smug and smirking, now lay gasping, his face contorted in pain and humiliation. The predator had become the prey, and the fall from power was as sharp as the blow Adrian had just delivered. "Daniel," Adrian whispered, cradling the boy's head gently. "You're all right now. Stay with me." "I'm here, Uncle," Daniel murmured weakly, blood caked along his brow. "Don't let them twist this." Adrian looked up, and something in his gaze sent a ripple through the crowd. Authority, not stolen or demanded, but earned in blood and truth. At that moment, Patrick Cole, the private investigator who had been tracking this rot for months, raised his voice above the murmurs. "Everyone, stay close to them," he shouted, motioning urgently. "We need to move. They're not done yet." The passengers responded like a tide pulled by conviction. Strangers formed ranks around Adrian, Daniel, and Officer Grady, the whistleblower who had risked everything just moments ago. They weren't armed with batons or shields. They held their phones high, cameras still rolling, lenses turned toward every corner of the concourse. The operatives lingering near the walls, the ones in plainclothes and wired earpieces, watched with mounting tension. Patrick stepped closer, his voice low but insistent. "The only thing keeping them from wiping this whole mess clean is the crowd. We have to get you to the press lounge." Now, Adrian nodded, rising slowly and lifting Daniel with careful strength. "Then, let's finish what they started." With Patrick and Grady on either side, and the chain still wrapped firmly in Adrian's right hand, they began to move. The mass of passengers, emboldened by the truth unfolding before them, pressed forward like a shield. They shouted at the operatives to stand down, their phones beaming the scene across social media. Within minutes, live feeds had exploded online, already trending worldwide. The chant returned, this time louder, fueled by shared outrage. "Justice! Justice!" The plainclothesmen hesitated. They'd been trained to neutralize threats, to erase evidence, but this wasn't a secret hallway or a hidden room. This was a stage, and the world was watching. Exposure was more dangerous than confrontation now. One by one, they backed away into the shadows from which they had emerged, their faces cold and unreadable. As they passed through the concourse, a boy in a baseball cap stepped aside and whispered, "Go get them, Judge." Adrian offered a subtle nod, but his eyes never strayed from their path. He was no longer walking through an airport. He was leading a procession toward something far greater than justice for one boy. Patrick leaned in again. "You're about to cross a line most men never dare. Once you speak, there's no going back." "I know," Adrian said, voice calm. "The courtroom was always too small for this fight." They reached the corridor that led to the press lounge. Adrian paused, his arm still firm around Daniel, and looked back once over the sea of passengers who had become allies in a war they hadn't expected to join. The crowd erupted into applause, not the polite kind reserved for ceremony, but raw, defiant, necessary. Grady holstered his weapon, still shaken but resolute. "You're not just a judge anymore, sir. You're the reason half this airport didn't go dark." Adrian didn't reply. He didn't need to. His steps carried him forward with quiet fury, the chain in his hand no longer a weapon, but a symbol. For the first time in years, he felt the law was not locked inside a courtroom, it was alive in the hands of the people. The chain still lay coiled in Judge Adrian Kessler's briefcase when the news first broke across national television. The footage, grainy, chaotic, but unmistakable, showed the moment Trent struck Daniel with the handcuff chain, followed by Adrian's powerful retaliation. It showed the standoff, the confessions, and the crowds chanting for justice. Within hours, every major network, independent blog, and social media platform flooded with headlines. "Judge snaps back against corruption," "Brenton Airport scandal erupts," and "Justice in chains." The fallout was swift and relentless. Brenton International Airport issued a public statement announcing an emergency internal inquiry. The airport authority tried to frame the incident as a tragic escalation by a grieving family member, but the public wasn't buying it. The raw footage had spoken too loudly. Commentators debated Adrian's actions, some calling him a dangerous vigilante, others hailing him as a symbol of resistance against systemic abuse. The courtroom he once ruled now spilled into streets and screens. Inside a quiet hospital room, Daniel lay recovering. The gash on his forehead had been stitched with precision, but the scar would remain, a cruel red arc over his right eyebrow. Adrian sat beside him, silent. The boy's breathing was steady now, but Adrian's mind was a thunderstorm. He replayed each second, the smirk on Trent's face, the weight of the chain in his hand, the fire in the eyes of every witness. He hadn't planned any of it. It had been instinct, a response not from the bench, but from blood. Daniel stirred. "Uncle, do you regret it?" he whispered, his voice hoarse but steady. Adrian met his gaze, something hard and unshaken burning behind his eyes. "Only that I didn't act sooner." Outside the room, Patrick Cole was already stirring the deeper waters. With his access to internal files, he released a damning exposé just 3 days after the incident. Hidden in the airport servers was the so-called green tag list, a clandestine document naming passengers marked for intimidation, financial extortion, and illegal detainment. The list was damning in both content and volume. Names of young male travelers, often alone, often from minority or vulnerable backgrounds, had been systematically targeted under the false pretense of security flags. Arrests followed. Several mid-level officers were taken into custody. Officer Grady, now under federal protection, testified in a sealed court hearing, his statement confirming Patrick's claims. He recounted being ordered to falsify behavior reports, seize personal belongings, and even threaten travelers into compliance. His most chilling detail, however, was the recurring mention of corporate backers, faceless firms funding the abuse in exchange for data, silence, and influence over transit policies. Still, the biggest surprise came not from courtrooms or files, but from Trent himself. 3 weeks after the incident, Adrian received a secure request through his private clerk. "Trent Mallory wishes to meet. Alone." The message felt like poison wrapped in civility. Adrian considered declining, but something in the wording, something unfinished, pulled at him. With Daniel's cautious blessing, he agreed. The meeting took place in a guarded, windowless interview room within the Federal Holding Center just outside Brenton. A single metal table separated them. Trent looked nothing like the swaggering officer from the airport. His eyes were sunken, his posture slack. The man who had once gripped a chain with pride now trembled with regret or fear. "I didn't start it," Trent said, his voice brittle. "I was just following orders. But I crossed lines. I didn't even recognize myself that day." Adrian said nothing. He wanted to hear it all. "They had contracts," Trent continued, glancing nervously toward the camera in the corner. "Private companies, outsourced security, politicians in on it. The green tag wasn't just an airport thing, it was part of a bigger network. Profiling people, collecting biometric data, even selling it to firms overseas. I was just the one dumb enough to leave a scar." Adrian's jaw tensed. The weight of those words shifted the room. "Why tell me?" the judge asked finally. "Because they'll bury it." "All of it, and you're the only one they're scared of now." Adrian didn't respond immediately. He reached into his briefcase and placed the coiled chain gently on the table between them. Trent flinched at the sight, but Adrian didn't raise it. He didn't need to. "That chain," Adrian said quietly, "was your power. Until you used it against the wrong boy." He stood up, his towering frame casting a shadow across the table. He left without another word. Outside the building, the world continued. Planes flew, terminals bustled, and politicians issued platitudes. But inside Adrian's briefcase, the chain remained, not as a weapon, but as a reminder, a symbol, a promise. The law had been tested by blood, and Adrian vowed it would never again be silenced by chains. Moments later, the same chain that drew blood coiled around the officer's throat, tightened by the very hands sworn to uphold the law. If you believe justice should always be served, subscribe and join us. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It highlights themes of abuse of power, retaliation, and the inevitable downfall of those who misuse authority. Its purpose is to raise awareness, provoke reflection, and inspire accountability, justice, and empathy in the face of injustice.